Good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to another master class in our MSc Development Practice series. A very short introduction to the master classes. So we have been running this MSc Development Practice program, which is a one-year program at the master's level. And in addition to the regular classes, which we all do as faculty members, we are also being very keen and regular in organizing master classes with expert voices coming in from across the world. And today we are very delighted. We have a totally different form to a master class. Usually we are stuck, we were stuck with the form of a lecture, sort of a master class series, but today we have a book talk on the book Wreckonomics and why it's time to end war on everything. And we are really delighted to have Dr. Ruben Andersson and Dr. David Keane here, along with our dear discussant, Dr. Amrinaga. And as much as I'm aware, economics, the book examines why various wars and security interventions have proven so profitable despite their frequently disastrous failures. Uh, it sounds it sounds painful, but I'm really hoping today's discussion would also bring forth a lot of different aspects to the question before us, which also becomes so immediate and pertinent to the world around us today. Before we start with the discussion, I would like to briefly introduce two of our key speakers today. Dr. Ruben Andersson is a professor of social anthropology in the Department of International Development, University of Oxford, and is an anthropologist working on migration, borders, and security with a focus on the West African Sahel and Southern Europe. His first book, Illegality INC, very nicely titled, Clandestine Migration and the Business of Bordering Europe, which was the University of California Press publication in 2014, was an ethnographic account of European efforts to halt irregular migration, accompanies border agencies, aid organizations, and migrants along the Spanish-African borders. Professor Anderson's second book, No Go World, how fear is redrawing our maps and infecting our politics, again, University of California Press, 2019. This book, building on the multi-sited research, looks comparatively remote control interventions and the selective withdrawal of international actors from global crisis zones. Expertise of Dr. Ruben Andersson is migration, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, undocumented irregular migration, border security and migration controls, Europe, and with a focus on Europe and West Africa, anthropology of migration and security. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Ruben Andersson. Along with Dr. Andersson, we have the co-author of the book, Dr. David Keane, who is the professor of Conflict Studies, Department of International Development at London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Keane has received his doctorate from Oxford. His study on political economy of famine was published in Princeton University Press as the benefits of famine. He is also the author of The Functions of Violence in Civil Wars, an Oxford University Press publication, and The Best of Enemies, Conflict and Collusion in Sierra Leone. And he's formerly worked as a researcher, consultant, and journalist. His expertise includes northern Iraq, Sierra Leone, Sudan, civil war, famine, and human rights. And we are very delighted to have you, Dr. Keane, today as one of the speakers of the talk. And I should really say both of you are really good at naming your research. I mean, the very titling of all of your work itself is very appealing and wanting, really drawing towards it. And since both of your co-authors, please, I welcome both of you. At the same time, whoever wants to go first, please feel to speak for, say, some 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and then the second speaker can speak, after which the discussant can comment with their comments.
Thank you very much for that kind introductions. I think what we'll probably do, if it's okay with you, we'll just go backwards and forwards a little bit in terms of like a shorter intervention from Ruben and then me and then back to Ruben.
Absolutely
that's okay.
Fine. Absolutely
That's sort
fine.
of what we thought we would do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well,
Great.
thank you so much, Gayatri. So I think, yeah, we'll mix it up a bit and keep it lively by speaking for shorter sequences each. Just going over basically what this book Wreckonomics is about and the kind of perspective and analysis we want to put forward in it, which we think is of relevance to a wide range of actors and students in development studies, the study of international interventions more broadly. So that's where very much where the book is aimed, and we look forward to discussion afterwards with all of you, hearing from your expertise. So we start the book with an event a few years ago in September 2021, with a withdrawal, a very chaotic withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan and from Kabul airport. We find that moment symptomatic of the problem we're describing, the kind of failure of these war security interventions that we've been seeing in so many parts of the world over so many years. And kind of an extreme example of that failure playing out in real time in geopolitics with reverberations, as we know, into the present today. At that time, we saw basically the US forces scrambling to get out with not much of a plan. The Taliban was suddenly in a position to take over all of Afghanistan. And there was a sense of shock that how could this have gone so badly, so fast? Back in the United States, there was talk of reliving the evacuation from Saigon in the Vietnam War all over again. Biden's Saigon was the kind of phrase being bandied about. But all of that, in a way, hid that this was a crisis that had been years in the making. Excuse me. Since the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan in the war on terror, tens of thousands of Afghans had died, many more driven from their homes, and casualties had been adding up for NATO as well with each passing year. The occupying forces had plowed billions into the coffers of Afghanistan, but there was very little check and balance on this. Corruption was rampant. Distrust of the state was rampant, as the promised benefits from military intervention failed to materialize. Meanwhile, there were big winners here, not just within Afghanistan itself, but also among the defense actors, the defense industry in the United States and globally. Given that the war on terror had up until 2021 cost some 2.3 trillion US dollars in the Afghan-Pakistan theater alone, here were big gains to be had for a whole range of actors, from warlords to military armament companies, forces active on the ground, etc., etc. At one point in 2019, we came to see some of that illicit gaining from the war in the Afghanistan papers released by the Washington Post. And there we saw how time and again as well, these failures, the corruption, the double dealing, the money being sloshed around, and the failure to install any sort of stability within Afghanistan was time and again papered over and hidden in the paper trails, in the policy sector. So that each step of the Afghan war and occupation could be presented on some level as a kind of success, in quote marks. And more funding could always be found for new projects, including spending millions and millions of dollars on massive cargo planes for the military that were barely used, or big bombers that cost $300 million a piece. And all of that counted for nothing once Kabul fell. At the time, Douglas Lute, a three-star army general, an Afghan war czar under the Bush and Obama administration, said that we didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. And if the American people knew about the magnitude of this dysfunction, he said, they would be horrified. But this was more than just some one-off failure, as David will go on to detail for us.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, we sort of look at the Afghan situation and a number of other wars and fights that went badly wrong as a kind of a complex crime scene. We're trying to get away from the idea that disaster is necessarily a failure or a series of mistakes, and to look very seriously at who is succeeding in what kinds of goals amidst all this apparent failure. And I think in Afghanistan, a lot of things worked out well in the short term, at least, for people, for a whole variety of actors who were profiting from aid, who were instrumentalizing violence, who were instrumentalizing their own violence and the violence of the Taliban as well. And all of this tended to fuel corruption and, in the medium and long term, to increase support for the Taliban, at least to the point where they were able to take over Kabul again. And you had this ideology, Ruben mentioned Vietnam. You had this ideology of winning hearts and minds. If you can just pump in enough aid, you can kind of compensate for the violence, for the forcible ejection of a government, and win hearts and minds. But actually, and this again echoes Vietnam in many different ways, the aid was fueling corruption, fueling a sense of injustice and inequality, feeding into the hands of some extremely abusive warlords who were kind of welcomed into this coalition that replaced the Taliban. And all of this, the Taliban made a lot of political capital out of it. So in a way, you were losing hearts and minds, sometimes with the best of intentions, and sometimes I think not with the best of intentions. Um, and in the book, more generally, I suppose we're kind of trying to take this question that people normally ask of what went wrong and turn it on its head a little bit and say, well, what went right? What's actually going right in these series of apparently hopeless and destructive endeavors, the war on terror, the so-called fight against illegal migration, the war on drugs, and indeed going back to the war on communism. Who's actually benefiting from these struggles? Who is manipulating these fights against sort of ostensible and prominent evils or threats for purposes which they're not necessarily advertising, but which are in a way political, which often center on the shutting down of dissent, which are often economic, centering on the exploitation of aid, the manipulation of corruption, the benefits arising from that, the security systems that are set up to combat these various threats. And I suppose a central puzzle that the book is concerned with is, what is it that keeps a disastrous policy from ticking over? How does it keep reinventing itself? And one could take this well into policy in general, in terms of, we have all sorts of policies that we know are not working very well, but somehow they have this zombie-like quality where they keep coming back from the dead. We keep reinventing them. We kind of pick them apart, but then they crop up again in a different form. So we're trying to, in a way, examine also the knowledge systems and the information around these apparently failing systems and ask, who's benefiting from them and how do they manipulate the information environment to make it look like these wars are working, when actually they're not. And of course, we keep getting these surprises. Kabul falls, Saigon falls, everything was going marvelously according to a certain kind of official propaganda, and then suddenly it collapses. But when you're a little bit more on the inside of what's happening, the suddenness of the collapse is really it's kind of a mirage, if you know what I mean. So that's part of what we're looking at.
Should I continue, perhaps?
Yeah, sorry, did you want
Great,
to?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so exactly as David said, we're looking across these various very forceful interventions, particularly launched by Western governments, but I think we can see application much further afield as well. Interventions that are often framed as some kind of war on one thing or another, and that's our subtitle. Well, it's time to end this war mentality that we have to wage war, whether real war or indeed some kind of pseudo war or metaphorical war on one thing or another, be that on drugs or migration, even on a virus and so on. We look also a little bit at the politics of the pandemic in the book, among other things. But yes, essentially we're looking at why do we never seem to learn, and why, as David said, do these policy failures keep reoccurring time and time and time again, and who is benefiting from those failures? Cui bono, that old question in Latin, who gains, is what we want to ask ourselves of many of these seemingly disastrous interventions. So the way we approach this in the book is through a series of case studies of the war on terror, the war on drugs, the fight against undocumented migration, which we're seeing in many parts of the world, and some others for good measures. We go back to the Cold War as well, as David mentioned. And the idea is here to try and understand this thing that we call Wreckonomics, a combination of wreckage and economics, as you'll understand. Essentially a state of functional dysfunction in which one purported threat or another worsens as politicians, contractors, enforcers, different kinds of actors start to exploit this crisis or this threat for their own ends. So we're trying to understand the mechanisms behind that and see how far they can apply to different sides, different kinds of intervention. So it involves a degree of abstraction, a degree of stepping aside from very specific fields and problems and see what do they have in common here. And we boiled it down as far as we could, really, in our little lab, as it were, into 5 mechanisms, as we call them in the book, that keep perpetuating these disastrous yet profitable interventions over time. And we managed also to sort of get them to align with the 5 first letters in our book title, the REC, just for ease of remembering. They each start with, each of these mechanisms starts with one of the letters there. And the first one is a W of the REC, and that's for the mechanism we call the war fix. And that's the idea that all these interventions that we've been looking at start with a very basic maneuver, which is to transform a complex problem into a simple threat that urgently has to be combated, ideally in some kind of war. The war on drugs, again, is a complex problem looking at narcotics policy, how to manage that supply demand, what's supposed to be cracked down upon, regulation, public health, and so on. All that can be easily swept aside if you frame it as a war on a product. You launch a military operation, as say the United States have been doing for many, many years now, and treat it as an issue that simply can be combated away. And that simple maneuver, that war fix, as we call it, tends to sideline other considerations, such as, what about a public health approach to the war, to the drug problem? What about if people still want to get on a high or buy those drugs? What's going to happen then? Well, you're going to start getting an illegal market, some very strong cartels, as we've been seeing on the US-Mexico corridor, for instance. All of that gets swept aside because here we have a righteous, simple war. Everyone has to get behind it. And if you don't, you're some sort of traitor to the cause. By the way, there's a big literature on this, many of you may be familiar with, on what's called securitization, turning an issue into a threat that has to be combated. So we're kind of speaking about that, but through the language of war. It's really about how we tend to, in policy, in politics, get fixated on one issue to the detriment of the wider picture. We all know that kind of tendency. One recent case from our sort of part of the world, as it were, is the fight against migration in the UK. Just to give you another example. I don't know if you've seen some news of this coming out of Britain, but you have a huge political panic right now about the idea of stopping these small boats, dinghies, sort of inflatable boats coming across from France to Britain with asylum seekers who are obviously traveling illegally without their papers in order. And it has become a huge national crisis. You have hundreds of thousands of people marching against this. You have Donald Trump the other day saying the UK should call in the military. You have the government and the opposition and the newspapers all feeding into this idea. We have to fight and combat and wage war of some kind on the smugglers and stop these boats by any means necessary. Now, these boats, these migrants who come across the English Channel, make up a tiny proportion of all immigration into the UK, about 4% last year. So again, this fixation on this small slice of migration into the UK has been blown out of all proportion. And this war mentality is really crowding out other ways of looking at the problem, including looking at how this kind of approach to fight back the boats, to wage war on the smugglers, has already failed for a number of decades, including in the UK itself. It has been tried time and again, and it just keeps on being repeated. So that to us is an example of this idea of the war fix, fixating on a problem and fixating on a warlike simple solution that doesn't tend to work. So that's our first mechanisms right there.
Yeah, and the second one we called rigging, which is sort of the R in Wreckonomics. We might have easily called it gaming as well. But then we would have, I think, have had Wreckonomics for our book title, which probably wouldn't have been great. But the essential idea is that when you have the proclaimed objective of defeating a particular social problem or a particular enemy, there's usually a lot of subsidiary games that kind of grow up around it, which are much less loudly trumpeted and declared, but can be very influential on the eventual outcome. And, we find that wars and declared wars or fights tend to bring about, a set of conditions, including secrecy, significant degree of suppression of dissent, and the kind of imperative of victory and high levels of fear very often, in which this kind of rigging or gaming that we're talking about can flourish. And I personally was very influenced in thinking about this by the research that Dr. Balu mentioned in Sierra Leone when I was looking at the civil war in West Africa there. And, the rebels were really, in a way, quite a weak force. Many of them were children, they were not large in number. They still kind of disrupted massively Sierra Leonean society, and you had this horrific civil war. And part of the reason why they were able to do that was that quite a lot of actors within the counterinsurgency, especially some of the chiefs, and more than that, the government soldiers, were actually kind of gaming this war, gaming this enemy, and concentrating on the extraction of resources, especially from the diamond economy, under the cover of this ostensible fight against the rebels. And so you had elements of cooperation with the two, selling arms by government soldiers to the rebels, which people used to call cell game, and even entering into a joint coup d'etat between the government and the rebel forces. So the idea there is that sort of war is not necessarily what we think it is, and there are a lot of hidden collusions that we need to understand. And I think sort of taking that kind of framework into a more global framework, there are all sorts of enemies which have been labeled as evil. And we can think of them quite easily, Al Qaeda, Taliban, the RUF rebels in Sierra Leone, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, FARC in Colombia, the Viet Cong, one can go on. And the more vociferously they are denounced as evil, and the more believable that is, the more likely I think it is that you get a kind of a coalition of people who claim to be combating that evil, but actually very often have a weird vested interest in the in preserving that particular evil or that particular enemy, and even in engaging in tactics which are predictably counterproductive. So this is part of what we're trying to talk about in terms of these systems of rigging, sometimes collusion, people who say they're trying to eliminate a problem, but the problem they claim to be trying to eliminate is actually giving them opportunities. So there's a huge question mark about their sincerity in that proclaimed ambition.
To continue on that, I think this is sort of key to the idea of Wreckonomics, is this kind of gaming or rigging of the games of fighting a war of one kind or another. So you spend a bit of extra time on it. And indeed, as David says as well here, he comes at this from back in his work in research in Sierra Leone, going way back, looking at civil wars and war more broadly. I came at this from the migration side, looking at fighting migration, border security. And so in a way, this book is also sort of bringing these together because we saw a similar pattern in these areas. A similar pattern of this war fix, as we said, of fixating on a threat, but also the kind of games that are played when, as David says, it looks like you're fighting this threat, you're combating it, you want to eradicate it, but actually you gain from it. So if it were to disappear, your livelihood or your basis, your reason for existence, or your power base or whatever it is would also take a big hit. So your interests are not served by actually winning this war, as it were. So David mentioned various civil wars, other wars where this is present. We could also, of course, talk about maybe in the discussion the war on terror, where we saw this again and again, a collusion and different games being played, double games as we call them in the book, that are predictably strengthening the enemy. But where the actors who are saying they're fighting that enemy get benefit from it. We could think of the warlords in Afghanistan, for instance. In my fields of looking at migration and borders, we see this time and again. And we've heard many times about migration crisis in Western countries, of course, also in South Asia and elsewhere. These are kind of spreading all over the world, this idea that migration is a crisis. And again, here we're seeing predictably many actors who are gaining from this, from saying that on the one hand, they're fighting migration, but on the other, they need to keep that migration going in one way or another to make good on the benefits of fighting it. In Europe, we saw this very strongly. We still see it over many years around the external borders of the European Union, say in the Mediterranean. Gaddafi, before he was killed, many times threatened Europe with a migrant invasion, as he put it, unless he gained more favors. Aid deals with Italy were forthcoming, a lot of money, political favors and concessions. And so the migrant threat was very useful. You can play your role as a partner in this fight against migration, but then consistently also make sure that the threat remains on the radar, that you can open the gates unless you gain some kind of favor or concession. So we're finding that in many of these wars, the phenomenon that the key actors claim to be opposing is also surprisingly often the phenomenon that's helping them the most. And this is a key part to our explanation of why these wars persist for so long. I hand it back to you there, David, for our third mechanism.
Oh yeah, thanks, Ruben. Yeah, I mean the E in Wreckonomics we take as for export. And really, we want to emphasize that alongside this kind of gaming of the benefits of intervention, there's often an export or externalization of the costs. And these really tend to be rather systematically redistributed so that the instigators of failing policies are on the whole protected from the worst effects. while the most significant suffering arising from that failure is actually, so to speak, passed down the line to people who have very little political power or skin in the game. And, you know, a classic case of this was really the Cold War, as you know, in terms of, uh, you know, the Cold War for, to a large extent, for the West and even the Soviet bloc was a kind of a phony war. You know, there were very important exceptions in terms of Vietnam and Afghanistan and so on, for Moscow, but to a very large extent, the costs of the Cold War were externalized to the global South, and it was a real war, as you know, for so many people. In terms of the war on terror, you know, in some ways, you can argue that 9/11 has not happened again. From the American point of view, there may even have been elements of success in the war on terror. But if you look at it globally, in terms of numbers of terrorist attacks around the world, you know, increasing from about 3,000 in the year 2000 to almost 30,000 by 2015. You know, almost a million deaths in the 20 years from 2001 globally, depending on how you calculate these things, and so on. There's some really horrendous metrics in terms of the failure of this endeavor and the destabilization, you know, not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but all sorts of other countries that were not necessarily directly invaded, but where governments have kind of piggybacked on the war on terror. Sri Lanka, I think, was a horrific example in 2009, when I was there, you know, presenting the fight against the Tamil Tigers as part of a global war on terror, very ruthless tactics against civilians, and you know, drawing legitimacy and international cover from this war on terror framework. So that's another form of, in a way in which the costs were externalized, but it's also another form of gaming. And then I think, Ruben, I'll hand it back to you for the cascade.
Yes, we'll be wrapping up soon. We're getting to the end of our 5 mechanisms. So we've been through the W for war, the R for the rigging of the games of war, the E for the export of the costs of war, and then we come to the C for the cascade, what we call the cascade. The idea being, and we're drawing here on system thinking, complex system thinking, but the idea is actually very simple. It's a snowball effect, essentially. That often what happens in these interventions is that you don't have a direct linear relation between the input and the output. Something happens along the way and the whole process spirals out of control. This sort of snowballing of things just getting bigger and bigger, harder and harder to manage, more and more chaotic as more and more actors pile in, as the costs add up. So all this relates to exactly what David was saying already around the export of costs and the gaming of the war, where new actors start drawing on the language of, say, the war on terror, like we heard in Sri Lanka or in Syria or in other parts of the world, or indeed Russia. We start to see this proliferation of wars that takes on a life of its own. It's no longer under the control of the original instigators. And that simply means that the costs keep adding up over time. We could say something similar on migration, where North African states, for instance, have for years been playing that double role in fighting migration, encouraging it to some extent in relation to Europe, are now themselves launching into this kind of war rhetoric around migration in Tunisia, for instance. We see similar patterns perhaps in South Asia and other parts of the world as well. And then that tends to lead to knock-on effects. People get more desperate, you get smugglers gaining more money, you get more chaotic routes, more money in that kind of business, and this just cascades the problem, make it even harder to control. And that's our fourth mechanism in brief. And back to you, David, and we're going to conclude
Yeah,
very.
and this is, it's in a way, it's a phenomenon with war in general that if you delegate to other people the business of waging your war for you, which is part of, in a way, the externalization of the costs. If you delegate that, you're going to, in a way, lose control of much of the violence and many of the key purposes. And this is, in a way, what happened in Sudan with the militia strategy, kind of saving the government money, outsourcing the violence, but then these things zoom out of control, as we've seen with the current civil war in Sudan. So, I mean, the last thing is the knowledge fix that we focus in on. We've said a bit about this already, but, they say truth is the first casualty of war. We find really very shocking distortion of reality around these various wars and fights. We give the analogy of a fairground mirror, those hall of mirrors where you look in and you see a very grotesque version of yourself reflected back. It's kind of the opposite of that, where there's a mirror image of these different conflicts, where a grotesque reality, in our opinion, is kind of reflected back as something that looks very normal and very benign. And interesting example of that in a way is the whole series of successes that were claimed in the war on terror in relation to Iraq. The toppling of Saddam Hussein, that was a success. You remember the mission accomplished banner. Then Al Qaeda in Iraq was confronted. Then that kind of mutated into ISIS. ISIS was taken on in Iraq and also in Syria. A whole series of successes were claimed in those battles. And yet the problem kept mutating and spreading to other countries. And, the reality was, in a way, a long series of failures or a big picture of failure disguised by a long series of proclaimed successes. And this is part of what we were trying to talk about in Afghanistan as well. The image that everything was going well, similarly in Vietnam. And then suddenly, it's a huge failure. So how does that actually happen? And it does draw attention, I think, to the kind of erasure of history that is fairly systematic in most of these wars and fights until, as it were, history hits you in the face. It's a bit like the Soviet Union. Everything was going well according to the government propaganda, and then suddenly it collapsed. So how could it be so sudden? Well, it actually wasn't as sudden as all that. But yeah, that's kind of the knowledge fix.
I think we should be concluding here. But essentially what we described with these mechanisms, from the fixation on a problem, the war fix, through to the gaming, the rigging of the benefits, the export of the costs, to the sort of snowballing of these various wars and intervention, and through to the way this is being covered up in policy and in the public debate. What we really have here, we call it a bit sort of tongue-in-cheek in our book, a complex crime scene. We have to get to the bottom of this. We have to be able to look at this critically, analytically, and then push it back into the public sphere and to policymakers and say, look, these are the benefits that should not be occurring from these wars. These are the costs that you are not bearing, that maybe the public are bearing, various targets these interventions are bearing. So what are you going to do about it? How are you going to change it? So what we are trying to do here is to show a kind of mechanism that perpetuate disastrous intervention with a view to changing them, right? A view to targeting those mechanisms and make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes again. And perhaps this is something for the discussion, but I think what we are seeing is that these kinds of wars on everything have perpetuated, including ever since we wrote the book, right, on a global scale. They don't seem to be going very much better now than they did during the war on terror. In fact, again, all the wrong lessons seems to be learned time and again. Similarly on migration as a sort of fight against migration spreads around the world. So this perhaps a topic for discussion here for us. How do we address that, and how do we bring that into the public debate? But at least here, I think we are, along with many others, of course, trying to find a sort of a language that allows us to grasp what exactly is going right for the wrong reasons in these fights, who's benefiting from disaster, and how can we make that, so reverse engineer that and get back into a more sensible policy environment, certainly in international intervention, but also on a domestic sphere. So thank you. I think that will be all for us for now. Probably talk too long.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Andersson and Dr. King. Now we have Dr. Amreen Agha, who's the Associate Professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs, to discuss the book and also to discuss what you've shared very briefly about the book today. A brief introduction to Dr. Amreen Agha. She's a scholar with research interest in the fields of comparative studies on Muslim societies, identity politics, gender, and religion. In her research, she is exploring and understanding the role of women in religious revivalist movements and how gender is mobilized in national politics. She has done her MA, Master's, and PhD from the Center for Political Science, JNU. Prior to joining Jindal, she was a research fellow at Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi. Before that, she worked as research associate at Institute for Conflict Management, New Delhi. And her areas of research was political violence and religious extremism in Pakistan. And Dr. Amreen writes extensively, and we could not think of any better person to discuss this book today. Over to you, Dr. Amreen.
Okay, thank you, Gayatri. So shall we start where I left?
Yeah.
Basically how Iraq and Afghanistan became very perfect examples of this contradiction, and with billions of dollars or trillions of dollars being poured in for reconstruction, and which is of course encouraging a kind of parallel economy, also a very parasitic war economy, and which of course was great for contractors, for the local elites in Afghanistan as well, but was disastrous for any kind of sustainable development or genuine state building that Afghanistan required at the time. So the war on everything then embodies this inherent contradiction of capitalism as well. It produces instability both as a product and as a problem. And now, for instance, I think so yesterday I saw this news that Donald Trump wants the Bagram base back. And according to some of the media reports, so back for whom, for what purpose, whose interest? Of course, with the rise of China, you understand why Trump is getting so anxious. And as of now, Taliban has rejected this demand from the US. But things can change rapidly, you know, and in the interest of the ones who hold power, whether in Afghanistan or of course the US. And then basically that leaves us with a question, a real question, which is how do we then break that cycle? And also while reading the book, which is almost my closing remarks or other questions for both David and Ruben here. So reading the book, especially in the midst of the unfolding catastrophe in Gaza, and it's impossible not to see these dynamics playing out in real time. So, and also the language of security is being employed, is being used to justify massive civilian deaths and displacement, while at the same time Palestinian voices and futures are being systematically erased. And in that spirit, I want to ask two questions which are related to Palestine specifically, and one on the larger context idea of masculinity, and also which connects to your arguments to this moment. So when you read the Wreckonomics, you basically, throughout Wreckonomics, you show how powerful actors impose this external risk framework to advance their interest, and while drowning out the voices of the most affected. And in Gaza, who then gets to define risk and security? And how is this spectacle of war being mobilized to legitimize mass civilian deaths and displacement? Also, on the other thing, I want to ask you about the concept or the approach that you propose, participatory approach. So what happens to the possibility of a participatory future? Is there of a possibility of participatory future in Palestine under such conditions. And my last question, which is that we have seen how male-dominated state security institutions favor militarized approaches. And of course, they align their budgets accordingly. So do you think shifting from hyper-masculine, militarized counter-terrorism approaches or the war approach to human security-centered approaches is even possible? Or are we too embedded in the war economy to make that shift? That's my last question. And basically, these questions come because I feel these questions feel very urgent because they cut to the heart of what the book Wreckonomics calls us to confront. That war is not simply about military campaigns, but about the logics and the economies that turn suffering into profit and silence into power. So if humiliation and security can be commercialized into permanent war economies, then Palestine, for that matter, is perhaps the starkest example of what happens when these logics are allowed to run unchecked. So it forces us to ask not only how to end a particular war or how to end particular wars, but rather how to dismantle the very systems that make war seem like the only possible future. Yeah, with that, I think so I'll end. And thank you both, David and Ruben, for listening to me and others too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Preet. Thank you so much. And like Dr. Keen and Dr. Andersson mentioned in between, it's quite extensive and like a lot there to respond to. But we also understand maybe the response can be slow and continuing. But quick responses, Dr. Keen and Dr. Andersson, and yeah, to take the conversations forward. And if any attendees want to put any question, please drop it in the chat box or raise your hand. Thank you so much.
Should I go first, or you want to go first, Ruben? Yeah. I mean, fantastic comments. Thank you so much. I think, it's not really just the reaction to the book. I think you're outlining a really cogent and compelling analysis of your own, which clearly intersects with what we're saying in the book. And I totally agree in terms. I mean, I think it's something we could have written more about, but you can't sort of write about everything. But in terms of the militarized masculinities and the way that these various wars have been sort of repeatedly informed by sort of, as it were, collective definitions of, if you like, shame as weakness, which is very strongly influenced, as you say, by gender norms. I think it's very striking. With 9/11, you had Bush talking about, we've become a hedonistic society, we've grown soft, we need to show that we can stand up for our values with military action and so on. It's very explicit with him, this idea that we've grown weak and now we need to show that we're strong. And I think there's a sort of an underlying fascistic idea there, which was incredibly strong in Nazism, as we know, that corruption has now become prevalent. We've become, as it were, too weak, too feminine, too soft, and only violence. I mean, Nazism was the ultimate extreme version of this. Only violence will kind of sort this out. And I think, part of that, at least in relation to 9/11, was the shame and humiliation of being attacked in that way. I think it was intended to be humiliating by the terrorists. And the way that America dealt with that, in part, was through exporting the humiliation to others, including, as you mentioned, through the use of torture, which turned out to be a pretty good recruiting tool, to put it in slightly controversially, for a range of terrorist groups. So in a sense, you're taking that shame, you're feeding it through the lens of a kind of masculinist ideology. You're converting it into shame for somebody else. And then you're predictably reproducing the enemy because of the felt humiliation of being on the wrong end of a punishment without a crime. and the torture, and so on. So I do think these are systems that reproduce themselves. In terms of Gaza, I think you're quite right to mention that as a, it's really a classic and incredibly disturbing example of taking up this idea of a war on terror and running with it to the ultimate extreme. It becomes very difficult to even critique what Israel has done, as long as you buy into the idea of a war on terror, which to a large extent happened with Biden and has happened with various administrations in the Western world. So we do have to look at actions that are predictably reproducing the enemy, and I would include the flattening of Gaza within that, which can be labeled as successes on a short-term horizon in terms of, you've killed this number of enemy combatants. But to me, the idea that this contributes anything to Israel's security in the long term is actually ridiculous. And I think part of what one has to do is to talk about how these predictably counterproductive tactics are not serving anybody's interest in the long term, but are actually serving sometimes identifiable political and indeed economic interests in the short term. So I've sort of wholeheartedly would support your analysis. I mean, maybe that's enough for now. Ruben?
Yeah, I'll be quick here. I know we probably, everyone is conscious of time, and perhaps there are this further Q&A as well. But just to say, Ambreen, thank you so much. I think those were, like David was saying, that analysis you just provided, I was just nodding along all the way. I think there's some real resonance here between the kind of work and analysis you're putting forward here and what you say in Wreckonomics, and I hope we can continue discussing this more in depth in other ways. Again, wholeheartedly nod along to this masculinist ethos, the emotional dimension here, the affective economies coming into play. David didn't mention this, but he wrote another book on shame as well, which is really tackles this head on. From my end, my other work concerns fear. A lot of it is about fear and the stirring of fear and the politics of fear. So I think we do need to also shift towards looking at this emotional baggage here that these wars and these war fixes create. We say perhaps less about that in the book. We focus more on these, as we call them, the mechanisms, the costs, the benefits, the gains, the illicit gains. But we need to open up to considering in full these emotional dimensions here. And I think what you really do for us is to show the wider costs of this war mentality. It's not simply about sort of tallying up particular costs to the public purse or even fatalities and so on, important as that is, but it's also the cost to a democratic environment, to the ability to speak to one another. And you talked about the possibility of a participatory approach, say, amid the destruction, the absolute destruction of Gaza. I mean, I don't know. I think it has to be possible. So, like I said, at some point, this will be the only way forward: is to create these spaces for dialogue and participation and discussion. So, in a way, the methodology we need here, I feel, has some resonance between what we do as analysts, as academics coming into this field, actually listening to people we may not agree with at all, and trying to find out what do we have in common, and what is your understanding of the situation. That is clearly the key part, as you said as well, diplomacy, democracy, that has often been entirely left out of this war framework. So I don't know what else to add here. I think there's so much to say about Gaza, about the wider questions, the wider costs you raise for us, about the emotions, the gender dimensions. I just wish we had a whole weekend to sort of discuss it. But we'll have to do that later. Just very quickly on what you said about shifting the approach from this hyper security masculine approach to somewhere else. We do talk about that a bit more in the book, specifically in the conclusions, where we say that what these wars have done, they put a lot of power and money into the coercive apparatus of the state, into the, again, very hierarchical, masculine security aspects of the state, the men with guns, right? And interior ministries often, who captured issues such as migration and narcotics policy. Even terrorism, becomes just a matter of waging a war instead of waging diplomacy, or what we call in the book, waging peace. So there is, of course, an opportunity to shift here. We have certain hesitations around human security. Of course, it's a much better framework, but we've also seen it misused in many ways over the years, certainly on migration, where humanitarian justifications, the human security justifications are being used to create more rather than less of a military approach. You have to save people for their own good, and so push them back into North Africa, say, instead of coming to Europe. So this can be misused in various ways. But that said, I think there are ways of shifting the balance back. And looking into history is really important here. Many of these wars are a quite recent pedigree, and there were different ways of doing things at earlier points in time in many parts of the world, still are today. Shifting the balance back on migration, say from interior ministries, from fighting these wars, to social ministries, labor. The ILO, International Labour Organization, should have a big role to play here, for instance, internationally, similarly on domestic level. Drugs policy, public health versus the whole military security apparatus, drug enforcement administration in the US. What's happening now is that often the gains accrue in the coercive apparatus, the costs accrue on the social side of the ledger. So there will also be many people within the state system, and we found that even interviewing border guards, but certainly in social ministries. So they know they are dealing with the costs and the consequences, and they want to see a different approach. I think here there is really a way towards another kind of intervention, towards starting to dismantle the incentives of endless war. But it won't be easy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Anything more to add from you, Angie?
No, I think so. It's good. Yeah, thanks.
So we don't have any questions in the chat box also. I think the glitch in between, we lost a few people. We're really sorry for that. And it's been great. It's been really great listening to Dr. Andersson and Dr. Keane. And thank you for doing the kind of work you're doing. And I'm feeling such depth of discussion you added to it, and we really look at it this as some sort of a beginning of a conversation, which we hope we can continue through consecutive events, programs, collaborations. We don't know, we can look at it, but thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Keane, Dr. Andersson, Dr. Ampli, for joining us on a Saturday evening here in India, and being part of this conversation. And some of our students were there, and so we will of course reconnect with them to ask on their own reflections on this. And thank you so much.
Thank
if
you.
you have any
Thank you so much.
remarks to add, please add, but otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully we can keep in touch. And I must say that, when I started talking with Ruben about some of these issues, that, one of the pleasures in doing that was that somebody else had observed, sort of very related phenomena to some extent a similar way. And rather than feeling of panic that you might sometimes get in academia, that somebody is, as it were, on your territory, this was sort of a fantastic relief in a way, that somebody would see things in a somewhat similar way to yourself, and in a way that's been now replicated in a different way with what Ambreen was saying, because I really feel you're coming at it with a entirely independent analysis. Obviously, you've read the book, but and there's so much sort of overlap and resonance and insight, I think, in what you've been saying, that it's sort of simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring that one is not going completely mad, and terrifying that you're sort of in a way seeing a similar reality.
Yeah, and it is a terrifying reality in many ways, and I think all we can do is analyze it together and build these relationships and build these conversations and take it from there back into the real world. So thank you so much, Gayatri and Breen. And thanks everybody. It's really been
Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
We are very sure researching on conflict is not easy. So, and these are not easy times to research on conflict. But thank you so much. Hope all this makes sense to people and like some conversations outside the world, immediate worlds of ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thanks a
Thank you.
lot. Okay, good day to all. Yeah.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.